The notification came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I'd been lying in bed staring at my phone, waiting for the job offer email from the firm in Boston. 3 rounds of interviews, 6 weeks of hoping, and there it was. Not the email I was waiting for, but a text from my stepmother that said, "We know what you did. Don't bother coming home for Thanksgiving." I sat up in my dark apartment in Columbus, read it 4 times, and felt nothing. Not panic, not confusion, just that familiar hollow feeling, the one I'd been carrying since I was 9 years old and first learned that in our house, being right didn't matter as much as being believed. Before I tell you what my father found on my stepsister's laptop, the thing that changed every single thing, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know how far this reaches. I need to back up 6 weeks. My father remarried when I was 11. His wife. I'll call her my stepmother because that's what she is. Biologically, legally, emotionally. Came with a daughter 2 years older than me. My stepsister was 17 when they moved in. I was 15. We were never close, but we were never cruel to each other either. At least I thought we weren't. What I understand now is that cruelty doesn't always look like cruelty when you're standing inside it. Sometimes it looks like normal. Sometimes it looks like just the way things are. My stepmother had a very specific way of organizing the world. She didn't do it loudly or obviously. She did it the way you rearrange furniture. Slowly, incrementally, until one day you look up and the whole room is different and you can't remember what it used to look like. My stepsister was the capable one, the dependable one, the one who remembered birthdays and made good impressions on the neighbors and never left dishes in the sink. And I was the other one. The one who was always almost good enough. The one whose accomplishments were received politely, but whose failures were discussed thoroughly. My father didn't see it. I don't say that to be harsh. He's not a cruel man. He's a man who works long hours and trusts the people he loves and genuinely believed that a peaceful household was a happy one. My stepmother was very good at peaceful. She never raised her voice. She never said anything overtly unkind. She just arranged things. And I grew up arranged. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had mostly made peace with it. I had my own apartment, my own life. I came home for holidays, smiled at the right moments, helped with dishes, and left before anything could turn. I was good at managed distance. I thought that was enough. Then the fellowship happened. I'm a graphic designer. Have been since college. I'm good at it. Not in an arrogant way, just in the way that you know you're good at something because people keep paying you to do it and occasionally tell you that you changed how they see something. Last spring, I applied for a competitive design fellowship in Boston. It was a year-long program, fully funded, with a $40,000 stipend and placements at 3 of the top creative agencies in the country. Fewer than 20 people get accepted nationally. I applied on a whim, honestly. I didn't expect anything. I got to the final round. I didn't tell my stepmother or stepsister. I told my father, quietly, over the phone. He was proud in that understated way of his. "That's really something, honey," and I asked him to keep it between us until I knew for sure. I didn't want to jinx it. He agreed. What I didn't know was that my stepsister had also applied. She never told me. She never told anyone, apparently, not my father, not my stepmother. She applied on her own, made it to the second round, and was eliminated. I didn't find any of this out until much later, but she knew. She knew the whole time. She knew she'd been rejected, and she knew I was still in it, and she sat with that knowledge for weeks while smiling at me across the dinner table at Labor Day. The notification I got at 11:47 p.m., the one telling me not to come home for Thanksgiving, came 3 days after my final fellowship interview. My father had let it slip at dinner that I'd made the final round. He thought he was sharing good news. He didn't know he was handing my stepsister a grenade. The accusation was this: I had plagiarized her portfolio. Not just vaguely influenced, outright stolen, according to my stepmother's text. Copied her design concepts, passed them off as my own, used them to advance in a fellowship that should have been hers. She had screenshots, my stepmother said. She had proof. She had already contacted the fellowship committee. I sat in my dark apartment in Columbus and read that text and felt the hollow feeling spread from my chest into my hands. Because here's the thing about growing up the way I grew up. When you spent enough years being the one who is wrong, you start to wonder if maybe you are, even when you know you aren't, even when the accusation is so absurd it should be dismissible. There's a voice. It lives somewhere around your sternum, and it says, "What if?" I put my phone face down on the mattress. I didn't call my stepmother back. I didn't call my stepsister. I didn't even call my father. I called my aunt. My aunt is my mother's older sister. My mom passed when I was 7, and my aunt has been, quietly, consistently, the person in my life who tells me the truth. She doesn't soften things unnecessarily. She doesn't perform comfort. She just says what's real. When I called her that night at midnight, I told her everything in one long run-on sentence, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you have documentation of your own work process?" I did. Designers usually do: sketches, drafts, version histories, client emails, time-stamped files. I had everything. I had records going back 4 years showing the evolution of the specific concepts my stepsister was claiming I'd stolen. I had a mood board from 2021 with dated notes in my own handwriting. I had client invoices referencing the same visual language, dated months before my stepsister could have possibly shown me anything. My aunt said, "Then you don't need to defend yourself to your stepmother. You need to send all of that directly to the fellowship." I did exactly that. I compiled everything, a 47-page PDF with timestamps and client confirmations and file metadata, and I emailed it to the fellowship director at 2 a.m. Then I lay down on my bed and stared at the ceiling and didn't sleep. Thanksgiving came. I didn't go home. My aunt had me over instead. We ate turkey sandwiches and watched old movies, and she didn't make me talk about it unless I wanted to. I wanted to, so we did. She let me be angry without telling me to calm down. She let me be sad without redirecting me toward gratitude. She just sat with me in it, which is a more radical act of love than most people realize. My father called twice. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. I knew that if I heard his voice, I would either cry or say something I couldn't unsay, and I needed to be steadier than I currently was before I had that conversation. On the Friday after Thanksgiving, the fellowship director emailed me. They had reviewed both submissions, mine and my stepsister's. They had looked at the documentation I provided. They had also, independently, pulled the metadata from my stepsister portfolio files. File metadata doesn't lie. It records when a document was created, when it was modified, what software version was used. My stepsister's original concepts, the ones she claimed I had stolen, had creation timestamps that were 3 weeks after my interview materials were submitted to the fellowship portal. She hadn't just accused me of plagiarism, she had fabricated evidence of it after the fact. Created files, backdated what she could, and submitted them to the committee as originals. The fellowship director's email was professional and careful. It said they were not in a position to share details of another applicant's submission, but that they were satisfied with the documentation I had provided, that my standing in the selection process remained unchanged, and that they were reporting the matter to their ethics board. I read the email 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my father. He called within 4 minutes. I answered this time. He didn't say much at first. I could hear him breathing. He asked me to tell him everything from the beginning, and I did, calmly, without editorializing, just the timeline, the application, the final round, the 11:47 p.m. text, the accusation, the documentation, the fellowship director's findings. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need you to come home." I said, "I'm not sure that's a good idea right now." He said, "I need you to come home so you can be there when I have this conversation. You deserve to be in the room." I drove home the next morning. I want to tell you what I walked into because it matters. My stepsister was in the kitchen when I arrived. She looked up when I came in, and something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that the architecture of her plan had developed a crack. She recovered quickly. She said hello in a normal voice and turned back to her coffee. My stepmother was in the living room. She stood when I came in, and her expression was the one I'd seen my whole life, the pleasant, impenetrable surface that could mean anything and committed to nothing. She said, "I'm glad you could make it," as if I'd missed a holiday dinner and was simply late. My father was at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He had asked, before I arrived, to see my stepsister's portfolio. Not in an accusatory way. He'd framed it as interest, wanting to understand the work she'd submitted for the fellowship. She'd shown him the files willingly. Why wouldn't she? She thought the metadata had been scrubbed. She thought she'd been careful. She hadn't been careful enough. My father is not a tech person, but the fellowship director's email had mentioned metadata specifically, and he'd spent the previous night watching YouTube tutorials. He downloaded a free metadata viewer and pulled up my stepsister's portfolio files while she was asleep. What he found wasn't hidden. It was right there in the file properties, visible to anyone who thought to look. The original concept boards she'd submitted as evidence against me had been created in a 2-hour window. 3 weeks after my fellowship materials were already in the committee's hands. The modification timestamps showed she'd worked on them continuously from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. on a single Tuesday night. One of the files had been saved with a version name that still contained the default text from a template she'd downloaded, a template titled Backdated Portfolio Draft V2. She hadn't even changed the file name. My father waited until we were all in the living room. He didn't set the laptop up on the TV like some kind of courtroom presentation. He just sat down across from my stepsister with the screen facing her and said, "I want to understand something." She looked at the screen. Her face didn't collapse all at once. It went in stages. First, the pleasant surface, then something underneath it shifting, then a very brief moment of what I can only describe as calculation as she tried to find the angle that still worked. There wasn't one. "The file is called Backdated Portfolio Draft V2, my father said. His voice was quiet. That particular quietness I hadn't heard from him in years. The one that means he has already decided something and is simply delivering the news. "Tell me what that means." My stepsister said nothing. My stepmother said, "Those are just file names. They don't mean anything. Anyone can name a file whatever the creation date," my father said, "is November 14th. Her fellowship materials were submitted October 22nd. Silence. "She couldn't have copied work that didn't exist yet," he said. More silence. What happened next is the part that will stay with me. My stepmother, the woman who had arranged my world for 15 years, who had never once in my memory raised her voice or lost her composure, looked at my stepsister and said, "You told me you had proof." And my stepsister, for the first time since I had walked in, looked like what she was, someone who had made a very large mistake and had run out of room. "I did have proof," she said. and a voice broke on the last word in a way that might have been convincing under different circumstances. "You had files you made 3 weeks after the fact," my father said. He closed the laptop. He looked at my stepmother. "You contacted the fellowship committee. You sent them these files. You told them our daughter committed academic fraud. I was protecting. You were protecting a lie," he said. I had been sitting in the armchair by the window this whole time, not saying anything. I had learned growing up in this house that silence was sometimes the most powerful thing I had. I watched my stepmother's face and I thought about every dinner table moment, every report card comment, every quietly arranged slight, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Not anger, something older than anger, something that had been held there for a very long time. My stepmother turned to me. She said, "You have to understand, from where I was standing, I know exactly where you were standing," I said. "You were standing in a place where it was easier to believe I had done something wrong than to consider that she had. That's where you've always been standing." She opened her mouth. She closed it. My father looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I want you to call the fellowship and retract the complaint. Today." She said, "Robert." He said, "Today." My stepsister made the call from the kitchen. I could hear her voice, even professional, the way she'd been taught, her mother's daughter in this, if nothing else. She told the fellowship director that she was withdrawing her ethics complaint, that she had been mistaken about the timeline, that she was sorry for any disruption to the process. The director thanked her and said they would note the withdrawal. When she came back into the living room, nobody said anything for a while. My stepmother poured coffee she didn't drink. My stepsister sat on the couch with her hands in her lap. My father said, "I need some time to think." He meant about a lot of things. I knew that, and I knew that whatever came next between the four of us, whatever renegotiation of our family's architecture was about to happen, it was going to be slow and uncomfortable and maybe never fully resolved. That's real life. Real life doesn't have clean endings. But then my father looked at me and said, "I should have paid closer attention for a lot of years. I'm sorry." That was the part I hadn't expected. Not the confrontation, not the metadata, not my stepsister's phone call to the committee. I'd been preparing for those. I hadn't been preparing for my father to look me in the eye and acknowledge the whole thing. Not just this incident, but the 15 years underneath it. I didn't cry until I got to my car. 3 weeks later, I got the call from the fellowship. I was in, one of 18 designers selected from over 400 applicants nationally. The program started in January in Boston, fully funded. The woman on the phone said they were excited to have me and that my portfolio had been described by 2 of the review panelists as quietly extraordinary. I sat in my car in a parking garage in Columbus and said thank you and hung up, and then sat there for a while. I thought about the version of me at 15, standing in the kitchen of a house that had never quite felt like mine, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong this time. I thought about how many years I'd spent making myself smaller in the name of keeping the peace. I thought about my aunt eating turkey sandwiches with me on Thanksgiving when I had nowhere else to be. I thought about my father, sitting across from my stepsister with a laptop and a metadata viewer and a very particular quietness. I called my aunt first. She said, "Of course you did." I never doubted it. I called my father second. He cried a little. He tried to hide it, and I let him. "I leave for Boston in 3 weeks. I have a sublet lined up in Jamaica Plain, a neighborhood I've never been to but have already decided I'm going to love. My apartment in Columbus is half packed. My cat is deeply unhappy about the boxes. My stepsister and I haven't spoken since that day in the living room. I don't know if we will. I don't feel hate toward her. I want to be honest about that. I feel something sadder than hate. I feel like I understand. Now, what it is to grow up in a house where love is scarce and conditional, and to scramble for your share of it in whatever way you know how. She chose a destructive way. She aimed it at me. But I understand the scarcity that made her choose it. Understanding isn't forgiveness and it isn't reconciliation, but it's something. My stepmother called once, 2 weeks after. She said she hoped I wasn't going to let this affect my relationship with my father. I told her that my relationship with my father was actually the least affected thing in my life right now. She hasn't called again. The fellowship orientation is January 6th. I've already looked up the design studios I'll be rotating through. I've already started a new sketchbook, blank pages, nothing in it yet, just possibility. I spent a lot of years believing that my place in this family was fixed, that the arrangement was permanent, that I would always be the other one, the almost good enough one, the one who got politely received and thoroughly discussed. I believed it the way you believe the furniture arrangement, because you can't remember anything different. But here's what I know now. The arrangement was never the truth. It was just what someone needed it to be. My work was always my own. It always will be. And this life, the one I'm packing into boxes and driving to Boston, this one belongs to me. I've thought a lot about what actually caused all of this, not in a bitter way, more like the way you trace a crack in a wall back to where the foundation shifted. Because nothing that happened to me came out of nowhere. It came out of years of a very specific arrangement. And arrangements have consequences, whether anyone intends them or not. My stepsister didn't wake up one day and decide to be the kind of person who fabricates evidence. That's not how it works. She became that person slowly, in a house where love was parceled out based on performance, where the perception of being better mattered more than actually being better. When you grow up in that environment, you don't learn how to compete honestly. You learn how to manage appearances. And when appearances stop working, you panic. You reach for whatever tool is available. She reached for a lie, and the lie had a file name she forgot to change. That's the thing about dishonesty built on fear. It's always a little sloppy. Not because people are stupid, but because fear makes you rush. She was so focused on what she stood to lose that she didn't slow down enough to cover her tracks. The metadata was sitting right there in the file properties, visible to anyone who thought to look. My father thought to look. My father thought to look. And my father. I've been thinking about him too. About what it costs a person to say I should have paid closer attention. He didn't have to say that. He could have handled the situation, addressed the immediate problem, and left the larger history unspoken. Most people would have. Instead, he named it. He looked at me and acknowledged not just the lie my stepsister told, but the 15 years of smaller things that made the lie possible. That took something. Honesty usually does, especially when it implicates yourself. I spent a lot of years thinking that surviving in that house required me to be smaller, quieter, less. I kept my work to myself. I didn't share my applications, my aspirations, my wins. Because I'd learned that visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny in that house always seemed to find something wrong with me. I thought invisibility was protection. What I understand now is that it was also isolation. And isolation is its own kind of damage. What saved me wasn't fighting back. It was documentation. It was the habit, built over years of professional work, of keeping records, time-stamped files, dated notes, client emails, evidence of a process. I kept those records because designers do, not because I anticipated needing to defend myself. But that's often how integrity works. You build it in ordinary moments, for ordinary reasons, and then one day it's the only thing standing between you and someone else's version of events. I'm not interested in wrapping this into a lesson with a bow on it. Life doesn't really work that way. But I do think there's something true in the idea that the work you do honestly, consistently, when nobody is watching, eventually speaks for itself. It spoke for me, loudly enough that a fellowship director saw it, that a metadata viewer confirmed it, that my father drove home and opened a laptop and found a file name that said everything. My stepsister wanted to destroy my way out. What she actually did was make sure I had one. I leave for Boston in 3 weeks. The sketchbook is blank. The boxes are half packed. My cat is unhappy about it. I am not.